live? Are we live? Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our Around the Fire, and I would like to start by acknowledging the Indigenous people of this land. This is Arukwa land, the Bundjalung Nation, and we would like to pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. My name is Dr. Arne Rubinstein. I'm the CEO of the Rites of Passage Institute. My guest tonight is Hunter Johnson, CEO of the Man Cave. Welcome, Hunter.
Thank you very much.
And we'll be using our talking stick tonight. And just a little bit of context, we've been giving some webinars on parenting in a time of crisis, and we've now transitioned to Facebook Live events. And we're going to be talking about, this time we need to be talking about the coronavirus and COVID-19, the pandemic, because it's so in all of our lives, but very much we want to be talking about ways that we can support families, ways that we can support ourselves, ways that we can support the community. And tonight, my special guest is Hunter Johnson, who is the CEO of the Man Cave. I've known Hunter for about 6 years, since 2014, and we might talk a little bit about how we met later on. But Hunter has been nominated for multiple awards. He was a Queen's Young Leader recipient and received a presentation from Her Majesty The Queen herself. He was nominated in 2020 for a Young Australian of the Year. In 2019, a Harper Bazaar Man of Interest or something, I think it was. We'll go with that. Fantastic. And an Ernst & Young Young Social Entrepreneur of the Year. And so, Hunter, it's very special to have you with us tonight. And I'd like to give you the talking stick and ask you about how it was that you came into this work, working with men and boys and creating programs all over Australia for many thousands of boys, and also just to tell us what the work is.
Amazing. I guess, the game plan was never to do this. First of all, I probably didn't even know that what a not-for-profit really was. I think I was pretty lucky to grow up around family values that was about social justice. But as a teenager, I was probably too concerned with if I was going to make the footy team or not. And I think through some pretty challenging years as a teenager, probably trying way too hard to fit in with my mates and just wanting that social approval, but also kind of losing myself in sport, and then having a major injury, which meant that I couldn't play at the level I wanted to play, kind of flipped my world a bit. And I've been, as I mentioned, pretty lucky to grow up around values in my family. I even remember once when I was a pretty cheeky kid, I got in trouble. I think it was on a holiday detention. I got another detention, and I remember my dad wasn't too happy about that, and he sat me down and made me write out my values as a person. And I remember at the time thinking it was a complete waste of time. What is this BS? Like, this makes no sense at all. But it's funny now, being 29 and looking back at that in retrospect and going, that was a really important time in my life. And although it didn't seep in at that time, definitely, coming back to values in a time of challenge, trauma or crisis is definitely really important. And so I think a few of those kind of important building blocks, also grew up in a really entrepreneurial family. And my grandpa always encouraged me to see problems as opportunities, which again, I remember him saying that when I was young, but I didn't really know what that meant until I had to deal with a proper problem of my own. And through kind of studying business and psychology, I wasn't exactly the best student. I would often rock up to class and turns out we had an assessment on, but I was smart enough to be able to get through it. And, through that, studying about 3 years through my business and psych degree, through an opportunity with my mum. What my mum found out about was to go work at an amazing organisation called the Foundation for Young Australians. And there, I moved from Sydney to Melbourne, kind of took that big leap of faith, whether it's a rite of passage or not, and completely found myself. I was, first of all, exceptionally lonely, lost what I thought was a lot of my mates, my friendship circles, but I was thrust into a community and a society of people who wanted to change the world yesterday. And it kind of made me think about all the beers that I was pouring at the bars I was working at and the late nights and what have I been doing. And throughout all of that, I was very lucky to have a father who really believed in psychology. He's a psychologist. So that was always in the back of my mind around how can I use my understanding of psychology and people for social good. And a few of kind of the big tipping points moments for me were seeing guys that I grew up with take their own lives. A lot of mates waiting till they're a couple beers in before they opened up about their anxiety or their depression. And then, some of the most important women in my life, finding out as I got older, them experiencing physical or sexual abuse as a young woman and as a woman. And, would it be about 5 years ago now, one of my best mates and I, Jamin Heppel, decided to run a program out of the back of our car for boys, basically just giving them a safe space to take off the mask they wear and kind of open up and be real and talk about what's really going on in their lives. And, I think it was that moment driving back in Jamin's banged up Holden Commodore, which, we laugh about now, only had one CD and it was jammed, was Bon Jovi, Living on a Prayer. And we were just driving down the highway, singing that as loud as we could. And I think for me, that was a big moment, knowing how impactful that day was, and then just having that high afterwards, that I was in the right place. So that's kind of how I stumbled into the work. I'd actually really love to ask you a question.
Okay, ask me a question.
All right. I know I'm on the show, by the way. I was interested to know, when was the moment, that the rite of passage, as is so intertwined in your work and a lot of people watching would know as, when did the rite of passage kind of click for you so that you knew that it was on path for you?
Thank you. Good question. My first career was as a doctor. I was a family doctor, and then I worked in emergency medicine and for many years. And I was always concerned by the number of, especially boys who were coming in and who were, doing crazy things, and teenagers, and really asking the question, why are they doing this? Why are they having these accidents? Why are they doing things that are, affecting their lives negatively forever? So that was one thing that was going along. The other thing was that my marriage ended actually when my boys were young, 1 and 3 years of age, and I had 6 months with them on my own. And that was a very pivotal time in my life when I really had to grow up and I had to look after my 2 boys who were both in nappies, and that was the first time I couldn't just do what I wanted. I had to be there for them, and that really made me reassess everything I did. And then I ended up on a men's program, and there were 80 men out in the bush for 4 days, and it was astounding. I was, your age, actually. I think I was 28, 29 years old, and men speaking about, what happened in their lives and being real, and that had a profound effect on me. And I actually discovered that pretty much all the men had the same 5 issues that they were dealing with. And they all had 3, 4, or 5 of those issues, and that included me. And the first one was unresolved stuff with their own fathers. Mm-hmm. That was still running for them, whatever age they were. The second one was, what am I supposed to be doing with my life? The third one was, when am I actually going to feel like a man and not like a boy? The fourth one was, how do I be in a relationship in a healthy way with anyone? What's it mean to be in a healthy relationship? No one actually taught me. And the fifth one was, for those who were fathers, how do I be a good father? And so all the men, that was they were the themes that very obviously came through on this workshop to me. And someone said, wow, it could have been so different if there'd been something when we were younger. And a few of the leaders decided to run a rite of passage for boys, and they asked me to come along and help. And I think the reason they asked me is because I was a doctor, and they felt like people would feel a bit safer and give it a bit of credibility. Anyway, there were 29 men and boys for 3 days, and we went out in the bush, and something extraordinary happened. And it wasn't just a good weekend, it was an extraordinary, life-changing weekend, not only for the boys and the men on that program, but also for us as facilitators. And from there, I became incredibly interested in Rites of Passage, and progressively Rites of Passage took over my life, and medicine sort of moved to the side, and eventually I made the jump and went full-time into creating and running and learning about Rites of Passage. So thank you for the question. And tonight, Hunter and I are going to have a bit of a chat. I want to find out more about Hunter's work and what he actually does and what it's about. And then interested to find out how it's changed with what's going on with the pandemic. We're going to talk more about Rites of Passage and how the coronavirus pandemic is in fact a global rite of passage, and how by understanding that it can actually help us manage it better and support our children better. And then at the end, if we can see the questions that are coming up, we'll try and answer some questions, and we've got some resources and some tips and ideas for people to support them. So, Hunter, would love to ask you, please, what do you actually do? What is the Man Cave? What's your aim? What have you been doing? And then, how has that changed? And what are you doing now?
Amazing. So the Man Cave is a charity specifically for young men, their parents and their teachers, that's really focused on young men's emotional development. And we use a team of incredible facilitators who go into high schools and create spaces for boys to have real, honest and authentic conversations, and give them some practical emotional tools to be able to navigate through their turbulent teenage years. And for that to be normal and cool and something that they want to aspire to step into. And I'd say the real X factor for us, the reason why the Man Cave's had such an impact over recent time, is our facilitators, who are guys in their kind of mid-20s to early 30s who are relatable, aspirational role models, but also super diverse in their backgrounds. So guys who are Indigenous Australians, guys who are former refugees or child soldiers, guys who are classic Melbourne hipsters, guys who are country blokes, to guys who are obsessed with footy. The whole idea is that they represent the cross-section of Australian masculinity that they'll encounter in the classroom, that boys will have themselves. And through our work, we I guess have worked for the last 5 years and have impacted the lives of it was part-time for about 3 years, and then Jamie and I got a grant. $65,000 was our combined salary for the year, about 3 years ago, and then through that we've now worked with about 15,000 boys across the country through face-to-face full-day immersive programs, also some camps in there too, and the whole idea behind it is, we know particularly with young men, 1 in 4 young people will experience anxiety or depression before they're 18. We know suicide is the leading cause of death for young men under the age of 25, so it's not drink driving, it's not overdosing on drugs, it's actually themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, we also know that 1 woman is killed on average every week from male perpetrated domestic violence. And largely the systems we have in place to deal with those issues are geared around crisis management. So let's wait till something goes wrong and try fix the symptom opposed to the root cause. And what we're trying to do is just interrupt that cycle by focusing on boys' strengths rather than their deficits, and giving them diverse role models that they used to get from their community. Now often they get those role models on Snapchat or Instagram or Netflix or YouTube, but actually giving them real life stories of guys they want to be like. And I think, the reason that the Man Cave's been so successful, I think, is because of those guys. And, the last year, our programs have increased 311%, thanks to our amazing team and staff in the office, which just shows there's an incredible demand for this work. And, I really believe that by us investing in the next generation of men, we don't actually just support the men, but it's for all their relationships in their communities too. So that's a bit more of an insight into what we do and why we do it too.
And what about now, Hunter? What's happening now for you? Have things changed? How are you coping with the whole environment? Very interested to hear about that.
Yeah, it's been bloody tough is the short answer. I think many people listening, our entire business model has had to flip. We were geared around running programs in high schools, through, and our team was structured like that. And one of the most challenging things we've had to do is make some redundancies, reduce people's days, not based on their performance, but based on what the business needs to survive through this very uncertain economic period. And it's been really tough. We pride ourselves in having an amazing culture at the Man Cave, and this is a time when the culture gets tested, and we come back to what are our core values and what are the behaviours that underpin those values. It's all well and good to do that in kind of peacetime, but when we're in wartime, that's tough. And so we've had to kind of strip down our business to make sure that we can effectively navigate through these next few months, and then really looking at how can this, whilst it might be tough, how can we look at this as an opportunity? So how is this working for us opposed to against us? And that doesn't mean we don't ignore, as I mentioned, how difficult it is, but really coming through that growth mindset lens. And so we've flipped our face-to-face service delivery, or put that on hold for the time being, and we're now focusing on, after doing a bit of research with some schools and teachers, realising that by us supporting the teachers is probably the most effective thing that we can do right now. So we're offering wellbeing support to a core group of teachers. We also get asked quite regularly in our programs, how do you do what you do? And I think the magic of facilitation can often look like magic when it's done really well, but actually demystifying that and creating the method behind the magic is something we've been really intentional around building. And so we want to offer those skills and training to teachers who are now facing unprecedented challenges trying to navigate a digital classroom when teenagers, or in our context teenage boys, are one click away from YouTube or creating a new Zoom call that their mates can talk over while the teacher doesn't realise. And the final thing for us is piloting some virtual check-in circles with boys. And we now have some opportunities with some of the most at-risk boys in Victoria, which we're excited to do the testing. And I think that's exactly it. It's a massive experiment, and I think we're in a global test, and at times a global experiment right now. And I think that the challenging thing is we don't know the end date. We can predict it, but as you know more than anything, in a crisis it's hard to have that clarity. So that's currently what we're doing.
Great, and we're already being asked questions coming in around how can people find out more about the Man Cave? How can they be involved? What do people do if they're interested to know more, Hunter?
Yeah, for sure. We the mancave.life, LIFE is the website, themancave.life. Originally when we started it, we couldn't afford .com or .com.au, but that's what we're rolling with now, and it's done us pretty well. We're also on Instagram, themancave_Oz, AUS, on Twitter under the same handle too. So that's absolutely how you can find us, but we'll make sure that we put a link in the comments of this thread too, so that people can jump on board and get engaged as well.
Great, thank you. And I know, because I've known you since 2014, I think we worked out, and you were working for Foundation for Young Australians, and someone introduced us, and then we met in Sydney at a coffee shop and started talking, and then you came along to the leadership training, the Rites of Passage leadership training that we did, the 3 days, and went on and have done all the things that you do, that it really gives you, your work, a great exposure to teenagers. Plus you have a teenage brother and a teenage sister, Indian Saxon. And so I'm very interested in your I know you're not a parenting expert and it's not about that, but you do get insights into teenagers and ways of communicating well with teenagers and supporting teenagers. I'm just wondering what sort of insights you have there, and anything that you would share with us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I'm actually lucky I have two wonderful sisters and one younger brother too. So Rive is my other sister. I think the first point I'll just raise is, meeting you back in I think it was 2014. And I remember I was in an incubator program for social entrepreneurs, not knowing what the hell I was doing. And I remember someone's like, you got to talk to this guy, Dr. Arne. And I was like, who is this guy? And I remember I Googled you and I found your talk that you did with your son, Jaden. And I remember it just blew my mind. And I remember watching a beautifully intimate moment with you and Jaden on stage. And I just went, whoa, this is speaking a language that my brain doesn't quite get, but something deep inside me resonates with. And I remember you said, let's catch up for a coffee in I think it was near Central Station. And the first thing you said to me is, what's your story? I was like, who is this guy? And, I just opened up in a way that I'd rarely done with older men. And that was a really important moment for me as a young kind of 20-odd-year-old kid. And, coming up to do the level 1 training through the Rites of Passage Institute was a massive, massive moment for me. I think, I've been fortunate to grow up with a father who's, emotionally literate and can talk about his feelings and has encouraged me to do the same. But, outside of that, I didn't have a wide selection of and my stepfather as well, absolutely. But outside of that immediate demographic, I wasn't exposed to a diverse group of men who were open and vulnerable and real with their lives and willing to share that in a way that would resonate with me as a kid who was just desperate to be around wisdom. And so the level 1 training was a big crucible moment for me where I remember feeling incredibly out of my depth. It was probably the first time as a young adult that I'd felt exceptionally vulnerable, and on the other side of it felt like more of a full human being after taking that leap of faith. And it really lit a fire in me. And not only that, I was exposed to a wonderful array of people who you've had, in that community on that initial training, but then also the other amazing facilitators around Ropey as well, which have made a big, big influence on my life. So I think, I think it's just important that I just name that. I think, and then, in terms of teenagers, it's tough times for understanding what's going on for teenagers. We hear a whole range of things. Some teenagers love that they don't have to go to school. They freaking love it because it's more time at home. It's more time to sit on Instagram, Snapchat, play PlayStation. Some hate it because their parents are suddenly on their back to do more housework. Some, have to do more physical work out in the yard. And then there's the reality that a lot of teenagers also don't comprehend at a cognitive level around the impact of coronavirus. And some think that it's an overreaction or that they're not at risk, so what's the worry about it? And there's purely frustration there from adults in their lives around how best to equip them to understand that this isn't just about them. And some of the things we talk about around boy and man psychology, around how this isn't about them being the center of the universe, but actually about them being a part of the community and supporting the community. I'm happy to go into more insights as we go on, but, there are some pretty initial updates from what we're seeing. So do I get to ask you some questions now?
Sure.
Okay, cool. Well, rites of passage, some people listening to this right now will have been familiar with this for a long time. You've been in for the work for 25 odd years. I'm sure there'll be people listening who are familiar with this, but I'm sure there are people on this who are going, a rite of passage, what is that? Like, I hear it, is it going to schoolies? Is it, is it my bar mitzvah? There's a whole selection. So, and I also don't think I think it's really useful for us to kind of just simplify it for people, regardless of how many times you've heard it before. So in most simple terms, what is a rite of passage and how is it relevant to our context right now?
Great, thank you. Well, in its most simple terms, a rite of passage is an event that transforms us, that changes us. And I look at life as being like a staircase, and we move up the staircase, and we move from being a baby to a child, to a teenager, to a young adult, to a grown-up, to an elder, and along the way we might also move to becoming a parent and a grandparent, and they're all these steps, and we're supposed to keep moving up the staircase. And a rite of passage is designed to help us move in a healthy way from one stage to the next. And the thing is, we will all keep moving up the staircase, and actually the question is whether we will do it in a healthy, facilitated way, which means there's community support and there's, we have someone actually taking us through it, or whether it will happen as a result of trauma or grief or something happening to us. So, a lot of my work studying communities around the world, they would all create rites of passage to support their boys becoming young men and their girls becoming young women. And there was actually a way that they did it. When I run my workshops and all over the world, and I say to people, what was the event that marked your moving from being a child to being an adult, a boy to a man, a girl to a woman, whatever, I would say that 95% of people describe a highly traumatic event. And that's a shame, because that then also creates a wounding and a problem. You know, like I talked about earlier, my rite of passage really didn't happen until I was 27, when I found myself on my own with a 1 and a 3-year-old, my little boys who were both in nappies. And that was when I had to grow up. And, it was very hard and very challenging. And a lot of people, their rite of passage is an accident or something bad that happens to them, or trauma or violence, or in some of the communities in Australia, it's going to jail, and all these things, and schoolies, which gets described as a rite of passage. Having worked as an emergency medicine doctor in Byron Bay for years and seen so many teenagers who had disastrous things happening at schoolies, I don't want those sorts of things to be the rites of passage that we have in our community. So our work is about how can we bring healthy rites of passage back into the community. And a rite of passage has 3 stages. It has a separation from our everyday normal lives, a period of transformation, and then a return back into the community, but in a different way, having transformed. And so, as I've been talking about on the webinars and podcasts that I've been doing, this pandemic is a rite of passage. Our children will be transformed. We will be transformed. The world will be transformed. And we are following the elements of a rite of passage. So we have been separated from our day-to-day lives. We're no longer, a lot of us, going to our normal place of work. We're not going to restaurants. We're not going to the pictures. We're not going to sporting events. We're not out socialising with our friends. We've been separated, and we've come into a container, which is another thing that happens in the middle stage for the transformation. Generally speaking, you would go into some sort of container. And I often talk about the perfect metaphor for a rite of passage is a caterpillar goes into a cocoon, which is the container, transforms and comes out as a butterfly. So we're all in our containers right now, and our containers are our homes and the spaces that we've created for ourselves. Now, we will be transformed. The question is, and the interesting part is it going to be done in a healthy way? Are we going to transform and grow and become better people as a result of this? Or is it going to be a wounding and traumatic event? And I'm very interested in that. And there are a couple of things. I believe the more we can understand what a rite of passage is and what element is happening, the better we can actually manage it, grow with it, and support others. And there are 2 things that are critical to healthy rites of passage. And one, well, there are many, but 2 that I want to mention. One of them is community. So we have to build communities, and that community for many of us is our families, but it's also the people who we are in contact with and we can speak to through the technology that we have now. So the more that we can be talking to people and sharing stories and checking in and finding out how they're going, all of those things really help to build community, because we're all in this rite of passage together. And the second thing that's interesting is that always in a rite of passage there's a challenge or an ordeal. And for all of us, the challenge in this rite of passage will be different. And when we get faced with challenges, there are some people who will grow and learn and become more resilient and more loving and more connected and take the wisdom of that challenge forward in their lives. And there are other people who will sort of be, become victims to that challenge. The challenge happens to them. So all of us have a challenge coming up. And as I say, it will happen in different ways. And I do want to, and I think it's important, and we talked about this before, to mention that there are people all over the world really suffering at the moment. There are people who are dying. There are people who are losing loved ones. And that is a challenge that is enormous and not to be taken lightly, and not to be taken lightly in the slightest. So they are very real things. But even when you study things like the wars that have happened and concentration camps and things like that, there are people who will come out of those and say, as a result of what I've been through, I'm going to be the best person I can be. I'm going to be the most loving I can be. Family and community is going to be the most important thing it can be for me. And one of the things they talk about in a rite of passage is that it's regenerative. it actually it gives us energy, it gives us new life, it helps us go to the next level. So how can we, from these challenges that are coming up for us, how can we grow? How can we regenerate? How can we get new life so that when we eventually come out, we can be better people? And one of the things I've been saying to everyone is, I have a theory at the moment that it's important not to be trying to continue life as it was before the coronavirus pandemic started. And rather than trying to sort of keep doing the same things and keep that going, it's one of the things that's so important for us all to be doing is looking at what is coming up for all of us. You know, what's being put in our face as a challenge, but also as an opportunity. And one of my challenges, for example, is family. I've lived on my own for a long time. I left the place that I grew up in 25 years ago. My boys have now left home and have their own partners and live in, different places. And my partner is in Sydney, and all of a sudden everybody's here. My partner's here, family's here, my son's here. And so, there's a whole thing for me about living with family, which means not just doing what I want when I want, conversations that haven't been had for many years that have to be had. And it's an incredible opportunity, but it's also very challenging. And I know, because I've spoken to so many people, that they are hugely challenged by having to be at home with their kids and not being able to go off to work and not being able to do things that they would normally do, and just having to be with their kids and their partners and their family unit 24/7 for how long is it now? It's over a month, 6 weeks for many people. So all sorts of challenges will be coming up, but I know that within those challenges is great opportunity, and if we can find the opportunity, that's when the potential for regeneration really, really happens. So it was a bit of a longer answer than a very short, simple answer, but it is my favourite topic in the world.
It's all right. We're in a pretty complex situation, so I think you can talk to many, many different options there. There's two things that kind of stuck out to me when you're thinking then. The first is regenerative space, and I want to ask you a question about that. And then the second is around eldership. And so I just want to kind of put that on a magic post-it note and hold it there. So the idea of, by the way, we'll be sharing some books that we've been reading during this time. One of them is The Archetype of Initiation, which I've been sinking my teeth into. So The Archetype of Initiation, which I think you have there. They talk about this element of regenerative space being important in that it's sacred time. And, if we think about time, in this context, there's kind of two times. Sacred time, which is that time where, whether it's surfing, whether it's like you're playing piano and you're just lost, you're in flow, you find that kind of central truth. Or profane time, which is where a lot of us live our lives now in the business of our schedules, our calendars, the to-do lists. And, a lot of the reading that I've done has suggested that with the loss of sacred time due to the Industrial Revolution, we now lose that centering, that inner truth, that regenerative time. And this kind of one quote which really stood out to me was that sacred time is often sanitized if we do have the privilege of accessing it now. And it's clean and it's seen as pretty and nice. But in actual fact, sacred time is often horrible and traumatic and tiring, depleting. So I'm wondering if you could just talk to us about what that means, because for me, there's they kind of contradict each other in a way.
Yeah. Thank you. What a beautiful topic, the sacred and profane time that we're talking about. And just to expand on that a little bit first, this idea that profane time is, yes, as you said, the to-do list, and when we have to do the shopping and the washing and the cleaning and the emails, and a lot of people, the vast, huge percentage of their time now is profane time. That's what they're doing. And sacred is that special time when, as you said, it's doing the things that we love. It's where the things that we get lost in. And profane time moves as on a clock, whereas when we're in profane time moves as on a clock. When we're in sacred time, time changes. So it might go really quickly or it might go really slowly. I talk to people who say, I go to my Tuesday night pottery class or my painting class, and all of a sudden it's midnight and I could just be there forever. Or I play music and I lose track of time. Or, when I'm surfing, or when I'm with someone I love and I'm talking to them, and time just changes. And we have a fundamental need for this sacred time because, as you said, it regenerates us. And a lot of the older communities recognise that. In fact, in Bali, I believe something like 143 days out of 365 are sacred days when they do ceremony. That's how much importance they give to it. And so a rite of passage is something that happens in sacred time, and it is that opportunity to regenerate. But, as we said, often there is actually a challenge, and a serious challenge, because what happens in a rite of passage is our core beliefs, our fundamental values are going to change and move to another level. So the beliefs and values I had as a single man were different to the beliefs and values I had as a father. As a single man, it's about me, I look after me, whatever, and as a father, I have other people I need to look after, and that will change again as a grandparent, as an elder. And it is often the challenge which is the catalyst for this change to happen. And that challenge is not pleasant. That challenge is often not easy. In fact, in the book, The Archetype of Initiation, Robert Moore, he talks about it, and I've wanted to say this in public for a long time. He talks about that the challenge in a rite of passage is often the equivalent of psycho-spiritual death and dismemberment. Psycho-spiritual death and dismemberment. Like, we just get all of our beliefs and everything get completely broken down and dismembered, and then we come back differently. And I mentioned earlier about how when I would ask people about their rite of passage that created the transformation from child to adult, or at any stage of their life, and they often talked about something very traumatic, but then they would also talk about how the more traumatic, and despite it being traumatic, that they also really grew from it. And so it's by having these real challenges that we also can really grow. And one of the greatest concerns now is that everything gets sanitized and we're not allowed to challenge. So I run camps for fathers and sons, and we have to create a challenge for these boys. And the problem is getting permission to create a challenge that is hard enough and serious enough and will humble them enough that they will actually become good young men afterwards. And I see, so many of our parents, we want to protect our boys and make everything right for them, and they're the little princes and they have to get a medal all the time. And then we end up with these entitled, sort of monster teenagers who just eat everything in the house and, are rude and tell their mothers to, rack off and all of that sort of stuff, because we're not, it's everything, as you're saying, has been sanitized. And we lose something from that. We lose something by needing everything to be safe. And, it's a conundrum when you're running rites of passage. Back in the day when they did a rite of passage, they might have taken 20 boys or girls out on the rite of passage and only come back with 15 of them. And they'd go, oh, well, that's the way it goes in this community. If they didn't come back, they weren't meant to come back. When you or I do a program, if we take 20 out, we need to bring back 20 every single time. We have that responsibility to do it. But to actually make the challenges so that something really changes is not easy. So therein lies what you're talking about, in that the sacredness can be highly uncomfortable, but it can still be regenerative. It almost needs to be uncomfortable to be regenerative. So the things that are making us uncomfortable right now in this container of the corona pandemic could well be what's showing us the way and the things that we need to face into.
And I think there's a line which I know that you love, which is often the regenerative space or the initiatory experience collapses people's prized narcissistic selves.
That's right.
And I think that's quite wonderful. I'm also, mindful. So we're in a rite of passage. How are we going for time, by the way?
We've got about another 10 minutes.
Okay, so we're in the rite of passage right now. What does that mean? Why is that important that people know? So we're in this, we've created the context, we're inside the container, we're in the mush, we're in the goo. Why is that important? And my caveat on that is I'd love for you to talk about the role of eldership in this. And, one of the wonderful quotes which I've heard you speak about and John I speak about is the role of the elder creates the glorious creates the space for the space for the glorious mistakes of the young, which I just think is wonderful. And I'm wondering how, if that is the overarching container of eldership in a time of global crisis like this, what does that mean for people who are listening?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that if we recognise it as a rite of passage where we've separated, we will go through a transformation, it will end, we will come out, and that if we can do the elements of the rite of passage well, we will get the most out of it. So sharing stories, facing into the challenges, creating a vision for how we want to be during this period and going forwards, and really importantly, recognising the gifts, the talents, the genius and the spirit of the people in our community. If we can do all of those things, it will really help us through the rite of passage. When we speak about elders, traditionally it was the elders who held the space for the rite of passage. And it's so interesting that we've lost rites of passage in our communities, and if we've lost them, that stops people moving up the staircase, which means we still have men who are in men's bodies but are acting like boys, and that's not a hard connection to make when we look at what's going on out in the world. And we need elders to be supporting these rites of passage. And it's our elders who are most vulnerable in this time of the corona pandemic. So all of us as adults and parents need to be stepping up into the elderhood role wherever we can, if we can, which is acknowledging it is a rite of passage, face the challenges, listen to the children, talk about a vision for the future, recognise the gifts of others within the community, and also where we can bring in the elders. A lot of the elders are in isolation, but they have computers. And what a fantastic thing to get our children, ringing up their grandparents, and not only just ringing them, but finding out their stories and listening to them and spending time with them. And the more we can understand that it is a rite of passage and where we are in it, the more that gives us the opportunity and the challenge to step into that elderhood place. Thank you for your questions. And in the line of acknowledging the gifts and the genius and the spirit of the people in the community, I want to acknowledge you, Hunter, for the journey that you've been on and what you're doing in the world. And, I know that you talk about, your teenage years and the sporting career that you had and the world that you grew up in, and you actually made a choice to move into a community and do the most good that you could in the world. And that's a gift, and I really want to honour and acknowledge that. And then you followed that through, and you did amazing work with Foundation for Young Australians, and then started up the Man Cave with Jamin, and then continued it on, and you've done an incredible thing. You've taken your work to over 10,000 boys around the state, and you've trained and inspired facilitators within your organisation, and some of them are working in other organisations and doing their own thing, and you're just warming up, it feels like. And I really want to honour and acknowledge that, how well you've done that, and also knowing you as I do, I want to honour and acknowledge the relationship that you have with your family and your three brothers and your two sisters and your mother and your father and stepfather, and it's really extraordinary to see you at this age, doing so much good and having this passion to do more and to do more good. So it's an absolute pleasure to have you sitting by the fire and to be my first guest. And people want to know where you're situated, and your base is in Melbourne, and the Man Cave is in Melbourne. And as you said earlier, there's a whole a lot of sort of different things going on, and you guys are working out how you're going to take it forward. But we do have some resources and some ideas for people who have been listening. We talked about the Archetype of Initiation by Robert Moore, but it's not sort of here at the moment. Anyway, the Archetype of Initiation, we'll put a link to it. There's a fabulous book by Arnold van Gennep called Rites of Passage. He was the Belgian anthropologist who in 1908 first wrote about rites of passage and the elements. An incredible book called The Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch, and we'll put links to all of these in our comments, but it's a wonderful book talking about the journey that a lot of women go through in their rite of passage. And then another favourite of mine, Betwixt and Between, which talks about contemporary rites of passage and rites of passage for women, rites of passage for men, rites of passage for elders, for youth, and there's a series of short stories and essays by people who are creating rites of passage. We'll also put links to the Man Cave, put links to the Rites of Passage Institute, and we have a Facebook group, the Rites of Passage community. We'd love you to join that. We have our e-course for parents and children growing together, 7-part e-course. The first module is free, so if you go to our website, ritesofpassageinstitute.org, we'll also put a link there on our in the comments below, and check out our course and try the first module free. That'd be fantastic. And the plan is to keep doing these Facebook Live events. And Hunter, as our first guest, will hand over and see if you have any final comments before we say goodnight. Beautiful.
I think if I was to recommend one book outside of this, there's a book that I'm sure some of you would be familiar with, but I think it's awesome to reread if this is the case. But it's Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is a pivotal book. I think it's 90-something pages too, but effectively talks to one man's experience in the prison, the death camps, and unbelievable book. And so something which I would encourage any families out there is to read it a chapter a night, or however many pages a night, and have a discussion as a family, because it's a book that's incredibly important, let alone when the world is in a major crisis like this. I'm also mindful that we've kind of spoken and haven't discussed any questions. This is your show, but one option that I was thinking of is we could take a selection of questions, and I'm happy to answer them offline and write some responses to it. But again, this is your show. How would you like to deal with that?
Well, I'm happy to answer a couple of questions now. I know that we've had some written up on the board, so I'm happy to go for a couple more minutes and answer a couple of questions. I'm struggling to read them a little bit, but we have got a question around advice to young men at this time who are really struggling with lockdown. And I would love to handball that question to you, Hunter, as CEO of the Man Cave. And I'm sure that there would be more than one person interested in the answer to this around, how do we deal with young men? And we know there are a lot of them out there who are finding this extremely challenging.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I'll just name up front is that almost every context is different depending on the individual, their circumstances, their life experiences, their own stories. So, I'll speak in kind of general terms just and hopefully there'll be some gold in there. I think the first thing is a level of compassion given to the young person. This is, if it's hard enough for us as adults, can you imagine for a teenager who's trying to fit in socially? If you remember back to school was all about survival, what social group do I need to fit in to be able to navigate through these turbulent teenage years, let alone the developmental challenges, your brain's developing, your hormones are going. You've got all that going on. Now you've also got social media going on. Now you've got a global world crisis. So I think, and then you're living at home with your parents, and entire relationships, whether they're from parent to child or to intimate relationships at home, are built on not being together, are built on people going to work or people going to school, and now we're together. So I think a level of compassion to start with is absolutely important, and to really empathise and understand what that young person is going through. And the most important thing is just to listen and to generously listen. You know, I was listening to Chris Voss, who's a FBI negotiation agent, talk about one of the most important things that he's picked up in his X many years being an FBI negotiator is to listen to the very end. And I think, oftentimes dealing with teenagers can be the same challenge as being an FBI agent trying to get someone out of a bank. So I think generous listening to the very end and really trying to understand. And often my experience, particularly working with teenagers, but all people in general, often people don't want to be fixed. They just want the space to speak their truth, to be heard, to be listened out, and to not have this polished answer that's wrapped up in a bow. And I think particularly for teenagers, you're lucky to get a grunt out of them sometimes. Sometimes they come out with a bit of gold. You're going, where the hell did that come from? So I think the power of what I'll call unfinished conversations. So just opening the door for little bits here and there become incremental building blocks for deeper, more intimate conversations when the young person or the young man does decide to come out and share what they're talking about. And I think as part of that is the power of non-agendered conversations. So often, and I can say this from my own experience, kids have kind of their parents just in a very authoritative way telling them what to do, and it's kind of one-dimensional. But the power of having a non-agendered conversation means that you can have lay the foundation, the groundwork for that truly important conversation that you need to have, where you lean in and say the uncomfortable truth or share what's going on. And I think also, sharing the impact of what COVID-19 is on you. Often, particularly young people, they want stories from elders. They absolutely want stories. But my caveat on that is they often don't want advice, and they don't want to be told what to do. They want to hear what life was like when you were 14 and you were struggling and you had that massive pimple, but you wanted to go and ask, that beautiful person out, but you didn't have the courage to do it, and somehow you embarrassed yourself. They are moments of gold because it humanizes you as the adult. And I think through those moments you build unbelievable respect and rapport for your young people, so that then you know that when there is a time when they really do need to talk to you about something, you're there. Or if they're at that party and something's going on, they know that you are the first person that they're going to call or send a text message to. Because that's it at the end of the day. Having that foundation of trust and love will navigate not only through these challenging teenage years, but actually give you the space to have a beautiful adult relationship with your teenagers too. The final thing is, we're all in this together. We have different roles in this, but we are in this together. And I think using the young people or the teenagers in your life to co-create solutions to the challenges that you're facing in your home. If you're having challenges with each other, which is highly likely, let's have a session where we talk openly and honestly about it. And something that's very important in our work, which I know is very important in your work, is the power of and space of a check-in. For 30 seconds, 60 seconds. How is life going for you right now? What have you been doing? What's on your mind? What are you challenged by? What's difficult? And having you do that as a family is really, really important. And I can guarantee you it's awkward, it's clunky, it's uncomfortable, it's weird at first, but it just develops a rhythm, and it's like a muscle that gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And then, of course, if the young man that we're particularly talking about is really dealing with something, professional help is always there. So I think, seeking a psychologist or someone who is a counsellor is incredibly important, and framing that as an opportunity to improve, not as if something's wrong with you, I think is really important.
Great, Hunter. Thank you. And I just want to go back on this check-in concept as well, and it's one of the things that's very strong in our culture, and in fact in our in the e-course that we've put out, the first thing that we do is teach families how they can do a check-in together with their children, and what we've discovered is that's one of the most popular things of what we've put out there, and that creating a space where one person at a time speaks, everybody else just listens. We use a talking object. It can be a stick, it can be an orange, it can be a fork, it can be anything, but letting that person just speak, and in the check-in, we talk about a golden check-in, which just gives some ways of doing it. And if people want to find out about it, it's a resource that we have on our website, and we can send it to people. But it's not only the opportunity for the teenager, boy or girl, to speak, but it's also, if everyone in the family speaks, it's an opportunity for them to listen as well. And when everybody in the whole group shares what's going on for me, how do I feel, what's been going well, what have I been struggling with, that is a very powerful community building and healing thing in itself, and creates the opportunity to then work out how things are going to be resolved, so or how we move forward. So also want to give a big wrap to the idea of the check-in. And the final question that's come up a bit is about young women, and you do a lot of work with teenage boys, and I do a lot of work with men, but what we're talking about is equally as important for young women. And I think a lot of the principles of what, young women definitely need rites of passage, and young women are also going through a whole variety of different experiences at home, and will be facing challenges in this period of time. And I think it's really important that we name that whilst tonight we're talking mainly about young men, that this work is just as relevant to young women, and that the resources that we have to support both young women and young men, we will make as freely available as we can through our website. And if people put questions and comments on our on this feed, we'll do our best to try and answer as many, if not all of them, as we can, because we really want to engage with you. And it's fantastic if you can join our Rites of Passage community group, because then there's potential to get answers from different people, and actually to have discussions about this. We have some ideas, but we're not the holders of all the knowledge and all the truth. So with that, I would like to say good night to everyone. Thank you. We will make this post available and can be shared. And thank you, Hunter, for being on tonight. And until next time, let's do this well, and let's do this together. Thank you.